Morning, everybody. My name is Desi Danganin. I am one of the co-founders of Undiscovered. But today I want to talk to you about something that's always kind of vexed me when I was growing up as an Asian American, which was the visibility of our community. You know, as a young Filipino growing up in an area that was predominantly Asian American, it was really hard not to compare yourself to the other Asian communities like the Japanese community, the Chinese community, or even the Vietnamese community. You know, all of these communities had their defined ethnic enclaves that really kind of centered their community. And growing up in West Covina in the suburbs of east of LA, we didn't have our own Filipino Cultural District. I'm talking about in the 90s when I was growing up in the late 80s. And I had the opportunity to go to a summer political empowerment program in SIPA in LA, and I learned about why cultural districts and ethnic enclaves exist for immigrant communities and why, as Filipinos, we never had one. But luckily, you know, the tides have turned and our communities have organized and have built new enclaves and new legislated areas that we can kind of gather and make our presence known. And you know, even in these kind of crazy and uncertain times of COVID-19, you'll find that gathering as Filipinos online is important, but most importantly is having this physical space that we can call our own. And so for me, the Cultural District Panel is one of the most important issues of the Filipino American diaspora. And I'm really happy today to bring together an illustrious panel of community leaders that are really leading the charge in defining what it means to be a Filipino in cities worldwide. So I'd like to bring up Dillon Delvo of Stockton's Manila town to give us a short presentation of his cultural district.
Thanks, Desi. Can you all see my screen? All right, so welcome and thanks for having me. I'm gonna go really fast, but my name is Dillon Delvo from Stockton, California, South Stockton, California, to be precise. But to understand Stockton's Little Manila, it's a little different because understanding Stockton's Little Manila is like understanding the difference between Filipino American History Month and Filipino American Heritage Month. There's a distinct difference. We're definitely more of a historical site, but we dream of having a cultural enclave one day in this area. There are virtually, although Stockton and Little Manila have the largest population of Filipinos in the world outside of the Philippines from the 1920s to the 1960s, there are now just a handful of Filipino families that actually live in the neighborhood. And so I'm going to start off with our TripAdvisor reviews. You'll see a picture of the Crosstown Freeway. So this was built in the 1960s, right through the core of Little Manila, which basically destroyed the community. And to this day, very little has happened. And the thing that I find that's interesting about this, that TripAdvisor actually lists this as number 20 of 25 things to do in Stockton. And so I want to go through some of those reviews real quick. One star, do you want to get shot? Says Daniel A. Do you want to get shot or buy drugs? This is the place for you. We're from the area and we avoid it like the plague. Not much to see except bums and criminal activity. Good luck. Eric S. Says, while it is literally a street away from the courthouse and police station, it is still drab and not lively. Plenty of history, of course, but there needs to be a complete renovation in this historic area for it to be taken seriously. And one person that did take it seriously was our amazing, beautiful queen, Dr. Dawn Buholano Mabalang, which many of you know. She was originally from Stockton, and the core of her work was Little Manila. Her book, Little Manila is in the Heart. And as we returned back to Stockton, Dawn went to UCLA, I went to San Francisco State. We took ethnic studies courses. We knew nothing about our history. We came back to Stockton and found out all this history about Little Manila and found out about the fact that Little Manila even existed. And so this is what we came back to. This was the article. One of the last two remaining blocks of Little Manila was being destroyed as we were coming back home. And the headline says, "Corner of History Falls to Progress." And you'll notice that the word progress is not even in quotation marks, right? Like, this is what defined progress in Stockton. They destroyed a part of our historic site to build a McDonald's and a 76 gas station. And this is the culture that existed in Stockton. That's what we were up against. That what we wanted to uplift our history, our culture, our community wasn't what progress was in the community. And so that's what we had to change. And so today, these buildings right here represent more than just history. They represent marginalization. They represent the effects of American colonization, racism, and racist public policy against specifically Filipinos. I'm not going to talk about it, but you can find out more. Little Manila is just one story of marginalization in South Stockton. And Little Manila also serves as the gateway to South Stockton. The ability to save Little Manila is more than a business transaction, because if you only think of it in that way, well, that's what gentrification is. Our community still has a lot of healing to do. And historic preservation is only actually possible when you have a really thriving community. And early on, we realized that there wasn't just a wrecking ball in front of our historic buildings. There was a wrecking ball parked in front of every one of our Southside families, and especially our youth. This is a picture from Don's funeral, who died of an asthma attack in 2018. And we lost a lot when we lost her as a community. But we were able to accomplish a lot. We were able to save the Little Manila neighborhood while Don was here. We created ethnic studies, an ethnic studies after school program. We passed ethnic studies in Stockton Unified School District. And what we're doing right now is we're suing the UC Regents to end the SAT and the ACT. We have youth advocates for social justice, both in the census, environmental justice, immigrant rights, asthma mitigation. We're leading Stockton's AB 617 process for better air quality. We are helping to lead the transformative climate communities in Stockton. We're involved in bringing more Filipino mental health programs and advocating for our community regarding mental health. And we're also involved in asthma mitigation. We dream of a day we have a Filipino Cultural Center, but there is much to be done. We believe it will happen, but until then, we will stare at these buildings and be angry at the simple truth of our history and the way our people were treated. If you want to understand what America's in the heart is, if you want to understand the pain of Carlos Bulosan, come to Stockton. It still exists. And until then, we're going to continue to teach our youth, lead them towards social and racial justice, be angry, and fight. Don't forget to vote. That's it for me.
Well, thank you, Dillon. You know, watching your presentation really does trigger a lot of emotion in for me. You know, it's a lot of sadness, a lot of anger. But one of the things that I learned as a disciple of Don Mabalon is to synthesize this emotion for action going forward. And I just wanted to iterate that, you know, her spirit still lives through a lot of us in her teachings. So thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, my kids are
Synthesizing action right now.
Yeah.
Well, up next, we would love to hear from Joe Bernardo of Los Angeles' historic Filipino town.
Can you all see
Yep,
my
I can see
screen?
you.
Okay. Oh. Hold on, sorry. Sorry about that.
No problem. Well, as you get set up, a little known factoid is Joe Bernardo is also one of the people behind this Filipino American Life podcast. And if you haven't heard it, it goes deep into a lot of cultural issues that we try to touch upon here.
Is that better? You can see?
Yep.
All right. Sorry about that. Again, my name is Joseph Bernardo, Joe. I've been kind of a long-term, I guess, historian and community advocate for historic Filipino town. I'm also part of the HiFi coalition, which is kind of a newly formed coalition, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So this is the map of historic Filipino town. I just kind of screenshotted this from Google Maps. It's just west of downtown Los Angeles, south of Echo Park, if you're familiar with the LA area. These are some of the cultural markers that the community in kind of different parts have been advocating for the community. So you see the freeway sign, you see kind of a Eastern Gateway, and some telephone boxes or electrical boxes that have been formed, as well as some light posts that kind of mark your entry into kind of the area historic Filipino town. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the mural Gintong Kasaysayan Gitong Pamana. You also have the first World War II Filipino American World War II Veterans Memorial, which is located in Lake Street Park. And sometimes you'll see like a jeepney. This is an original jeepney from the Philippines dating back from the 1940s. This is owned by the Filipino Worker Center, which is located in the area. And you could actually do some historical tours of the area in a jeepney. These are some of the community organizations that are located here. Filipino Worker Center, the Filipino American Service Group, FASG, the Filipino Community Cultural Center, which is run by FACLA, Filipino American Community of Los Angeles, which is an organization that started in the 1930s and then formally incorporated in 1946. And if you have a SIPA, Search to Involve Filipino Americans, on the bottom right. And then, of course, there's a lot of churches in the area. The Filipino Christian Church, which really started in the 1920s, they relocated in the area in the 1950s, and that is kind of the only historical cultural monument that is in historic Filipino town. And you have Iglesia Ni Cristo. Probably in the Philippines, you've seen churches that look like this. This is a kind of LA, one of the churches in LA, and one of them is located in historic Filipino town. You have St. Columban, which is a Catholic church that started in, right after World War II, because a lot of Filipinos couldn't worship in kind of white churches. So they started St. Columban, which is dedicated for Filipino Americans. And then you have kind of small storefront churches dotting along all over historic Filipino town. And of course, you have businesses that are located there. Temple Seafood by Kubo. Park's Finest, which is a community institution, which is located just outside. HiFi Kitchen. You also have like dental clinics and like medical clinics, optometrists that may not kind of scream Filipino, but they're actually Filipino owned. You have Geneva Bar. Dollar Hits is a place where you get Filipino street food. And then kind of the purpose of the HiFi Coalition is, this isn't the official kind of mission, and it's really kind of to be a community coalition of all the different stakeholders, because there's different organizations, there's different stakeholders, different institutions that are part of historic Filipino town. So this is kind of the latest iteration of trying to form a kind of a community council, if you will, in the area. Just kind of give a little history. Kind of LA's Little Manila was really in right next to Little Tokyo, and Dillon kind of it's kind of a Southern California version of Little Manila and Stockton. And then during the 1950s, a lot of the Filipino districts in downtown Los Angeles were destroyed, similar to Stockton's Crosstown Freeway, as Dillon has mentioned. So after World War II, a lot of Filipino Americans started to own property in what is now historic Filipino town. And then in after 1965, the Immigration Act, it really spawned a lot of immigrant communities coming to Los Angeles. And if you know Los Angeles, in order to be politically and culturally visible and have political power in the community, it's really place-based in Los Angeles. So ethnic districts are very important in Los Angeles politics. So in the 1980s, a lot of Filipinos wanted to create a Filipino town. This is kind of a ceremonial gesture by the local city council member during the 1980s. But then the official designation didn't really happen until 2002. By then, council member Eric Garcetti, who's currently mayor, and those are kind of the official borders of Los Angeles's historic Filipino town currently. Ongoing issues, of course, there are, it's a low-income neighborhood, low to moderate income neighborhood, so there's poverty, there's lots of, there's minimal funding for a lot of cultural-specific social services, as well as resources to preserve history. There's a need for small business support. Displacement, gentrification, if you will, is an ongoing issue. And again, many people in Southern California, many Filipinos don't know about the neighborhood, so there's not a lot of kind of community buy-in yet, which leads to kind of minimal organization. So there's a lot of organizations with little support or minimal support who are trying to create a historic Filipino town. We're trying to create a thriving ethnic enclave there. So that's a challenge that a lot of community stakeholders have. But there are possibilities. Many POC owned businesses and kind of companies who have moved in have actually partnered a lot with the Filipino community. Array Studios just hosted a Filipino kind of film festival. And Rideback Ranch paid for this mural right here. And Christian Kabuay, who's from San Francisco, helped design this mural. And these are kind of upcoming projects. There's a gateway. The city identified funding for a gateway on the eastern end of historic Filipino town. And SIPA SIPA, one of the organizations, is going to open up affordable housing project in their property called the HiFi Collective. And for the coalition, if you want to follow us, just find our Instagram, historicfilipinotown.la, as well as our Facebook group right here. And I will stop there. And that's kind of just a glimpse of historic Filipino town.
Cool. Thank you, Joe. It's really exciting to see the progress of HiFi. I did mention earlier that I went to a political empowerment program at SIPA, and the talk of creating HiFi was only just kind of a glimmer back in the mid-90s, and seeing all the work done is amazing. And I think the audience members will start to see a pattern of urban renewal being the boogeyman that has been vexing our community. But I want to go too deep into that, and I want to present our next speaker, who's Raquel Redondiez, who I feel like is my big sister, who has taught me a lot in organizing our community. And so Raquel will do a presentation on SOMA Pilipinas.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Desi, for that introduction. And thank you, Joe, for sharing that. I actually, in the 80s, when my family first immigrated to the US, our first home was in a historic Filipino town. We lived on North Coronado Street between Bahay Kubo and SIPA. So really exciting to see all the developments happening there. But today I'm presenting on SOMA Pilipinas, the Filipino Cultural Heritage District here in San Francisco, California. For those who are not familiar with the Stockton market, SOMA is short for Stockton Market. And as you can see in this map, it's a large area in the shadows of downtown San Francisco. Historically, it was an industrial part of the city, which made it more affordable for families to settle in, working class families. So Filipinos have actually been making home here for over 100 years. And Jose Rizal actually once visited here at the turn of the century. Next slide, please. So in the last, while historically it's been mostly industrial, and Filipino families with our neighbors have really had to fight to demand the kind of infrastructure we need for our families from the city, such as new schools, parks. In the last 10 years, actually, it's seen a major development with the Twitter tax break. And you have first Twitter building headquarters planting itself here on 10th and Market Street, just a few blocks away from the photo on the right, which is the Bayanihan Community Center, which is the headquarters for SOMA Pilipinas. Next slide, please. So it's not only Twitter who's made its home here. If you look at your phone and your apps, most likely, most of the apps are headquartered here. So you have Airbnb, you have Uber, Lyft, Instagram. You have 500 tech companies in the last 10 years. And what's transpired with that is that landlords have felt the pressure to push out working class families to make way for higher paid and tech professionals who can also pay more rent. So on the right, you see a photo of just one of our many community campaigns to try to fight for families to be able to stay in South Market. Next slide, please. Besides protecting existing residents, it's also a fight to protect our cultural assets and landmarks. Here on the right is a photo of Victoria Manolo Draves Park. It's the only 1 acre multi-use park in the neighborhood. Again, it was the Filipino community that helped fight to build this park and name it after Victoria Manolo Draves, which was a Filipina who grew up in the South Market. She, while facing a lot of discrimination, she actually went on to win 2 gold medals in the 1948 Olympics as a diver. But just last year, this really important cultural and community asset was threatened by a luxury development that would have basically, if built, would have shadowed the park half of the year. Next slide, please. Along with cultural assets like the park, we also have very important historical landmarks like the Gran Oriente Masonic Temple and the hotel, which you see in the middle here. At a time around 100 years ago, when Filipinos could not buy property, our manongs pulled together and created a fraternity, Freemason society, so that they can purchase a building, so that they can have a home to live in. And 2 years ago, it actually went to the market and almost went to the highest bidder, but with the community coming together to organize and to advocate, we were able to get the city to provide funding so that a nonprofit could purchase the building and renovate it to preserve it as 24 units of permanent affordable housing into the future. Next slide, please. So really the story of SOMA Pilipinas is a story of Filipino American activism, and it's really apropos here with Fonz and October History Month, really about lifting up the history of organizing and Filipino American activism and how it's really contributed to the social justice movements. So while we've been here over 100 years, and similar to historic Filipino town, the fight for recognition and to be recognized as a cultural district has been decades in the making. It wasn't until 2016 that the city officially recognized SOMA Pilipinas. And the year following, 2017, we were also recognized by the California Arts Council as a state designated cultural district. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, really the main mission of SOMA Pilipinas is to preserve our community, our residents, our cultural assets, but also to continue to be a cultural hub for the whole region for the celebration of Filipino arts and culture, as well as to really rebuild opportunities for economic development. During the first .com boom in the late 90s, actually, we lost a lot of our legacy businesses. And one of our main challenges and initiatives, and Desi is helping lead on this, is to really support and drive in new Filipino businesses like Sarap Shop, which you see on the right here. Next slide, please. So We do have a lot of exciting possibilities for SOMA Pilipinas. Since the recognition of our cultural district, we've seen more support and funding for our legacy arts organizations, such as Cool Arts, which is the premier presenter of indigenous and tribal arts in the US. We have the only, one of few surviving in San Francisco Black Box theaters, and the only Filipino-American Black Box theater in the nation, Business of Studio. And we also have new emerging artists, as well as arts organizations like Balay Creative. Next slide, please. Some of the early initiatives we've had is around placemaking and placekeeping. So on your left, we're really excited, actually just launched last week, our new utility boxes that feature Filipino words. It's a flashcard design, and it's not only to teach the young people in our neighborhood Filipino, but also our non-Filipino neighbors and visitors. In the middle here, we have our Soma Pride campaign, which was launched a couple of years ago, and it features community workers, artists, and residents. Probably the first time that Filipinos have been featured in pole banners in San Francisco in over 100 years. And on the right is a new mural called APWA that was designed to help raise awareness around Filipino mental health issues. Next slide, please. In the more immediate future, we're actually looking forward to special crosswalk designs along 6th Street, which is a major corridor for the cultural district. So in the next year, we could be seeing Bandig-inspired crosswalks, as well as other more permanent installations. Next slide, please. So similar to Historic Filipino Town, we are advocating for gateways designs in the cultural district. This is an example of illuminated gateways that could be installed near the freeway. Next slide, please. And here's a smaller gateway design that would be across from Victoria Manalo James Park, and kind of in an area which we call the Youth and Family Zone. And because we also have a lot of traffic in the area, the idea of living walls and living gateway has been one of the more popular proposals from the community. Next slide, please. So here, along our efforts to build a commercial corridor, I want to turn it over to Desi to talk about Republica and Kapwa Gardens.
Cool. So this project is our next step in economic development. Undiscovered, the night market, and also this online event is our way of generating economic activity and attracting entrepreneurs to the cultural district. But it's really hard to do that kind of work when you're only doing it a few times a year and on parking lots and alleyways. We do a great job at doing it, but if we're really going to accelerate our work, we're going to need 4 walls and a wall, electricity, power, and water built in. So the city of San Francisco is giving us this 3,600 square space that's been abandoned, and we're going to turn it into Republica, which is going to be a pop-up retail incubator that will have room for 3 resident businesses and 4 rotating pop-up retail businesses. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have a new project that got unveiled about a month ago. We broke ground. It's called Kapwa Gardens. It's really a reaction to COVID-19 and a way for our community to recover from the economic and mental health devastation of COVID-19. And so we're taking a 9,000 square foot parking lot, also owned by the city, and turning it into a beautiful space that's designed for 56 people to properly social distance so they can watch performances, take yoga classes, Zumba classes, learn Eskrima. The possibilities are endless, and that's a project that we're hoping to finish in the next 4 to 6 weeks. So whenever you're in San Francisco, come check out Kapwa Gardens to see one of the newest developments of SOMA Pilipinas. I'm sure we've covered a lot of information on 3 cultural districts, so everyone who's listening right now, if you have questions, please put it on the chat box, and we have room in a little bit so we can go over some of these key questions. And our next panelist is hailing all the way from Winnipeg, Canada, and this is one of the more intriguing cultural districts, and I want to introduce Joseph to the stage to give us a presentation on the Mabuhay district.
Okay, thanks, Desi. I'm just going to jump right in because I know that we're a little bit short on time. The Mabuhay district is the proposed Filipino incubator district for Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. For those of you that don't know, Winnipeg is approximately in the center of Canada, about an hour's drive from the North Dakota border. For comparison, it's about 1/3 the size of Los Angeles in terms of area, but really only about 1/5 the size of Los Angeles in terms of population. So it's really not a very dense city, but it does have a population that is 10% Filipino, which is higher than any other major city in Canada. So when Filipinos started arriving here in the 1950s, right up until today, a lot of them settled in the north part of the city because of its proximity to jobs and also because it was an up-and-coming neighborhood at the time. So if we zoom in on that area of the city in particular, you can see that there's two sort of major commercial corridors that run through it. McPhillips Street is in the middle there, and Keewaydin Street is just on the left. And here are some of the Filipino businesses in the area, and I'm sure I've missed a few, and I'll probably hear from them later. But just to give you an idea, if you could go from the top of this map to the bottom of this map in about 10 minutes, driving 30 miles per hour or so. So it's not a very big area, but it does have a high concentration of Filipino businesses. And you guys will probably recognize a couple of them, but for the most part, they are smaller family-run businesses. So we've got a lot of restaurants, a lot of bakeries, grocery stores, mechanics, barbershops. We've got chiropractors, dentists in the area, and we actually even have an architect. This wasn't shown on the map, but there are a few sort of landmarks in the area as well. So this is St. Peter's Church on Keewaydin Street, which is highly attended by Filipinos. It's got to be at least 90% Filipino attendance, and they do even have masses in Tagalog. Right across the street from there is the Philippine Canadian Center of Manitoba, which also has a few businesses and some services for the community. What's really interesting about Keewaydin Street is that a portion of it was renamed in honor of Dr. Jose Rizal. And at that intersection, there's even a statue of the man himself. But given all of this, given the fact that there is a high density of Filipinos in the area and there's a large concentration of Filipino businesses compared to the rest of the city, it hasn't been designated yet as a Filipino district. And it's also missing a lot of the amenities that we feel would be important for today's community. So that's really where the Mabuhay district fits in. So the next few slides really just represent our wishes, our dreams, and our sort of goals for what the community can become. So at its very heart, we want the Mabuhay district to be a place where all people can come to learn about, collaborate with, and find inspiration from our community. We want it to support our food scene with permanent and pop-up venues, our art scene with studios, production facilities, galleries, performance spaces. We want it to be a place for all Filipino generations where they can come to learn about our history here in Canada and also about our future in Winnipeg. We want it to support our businesses and our entrepreneurs with commercial retail spaces, offices, maker spaces, markets, and fashion hubs. We want it to also support our physical well-being as a community. That's my daughter on the right-hand side there kicking butt. We also want it to be a space where we can come together to celebrate with socials, debuts, weddings, parades, festivals. And let's not forget about mental health. So spaces for support groups, services, and activists. We really want it to be a place where we can showcase our culture and celebrate what makes us Filipino together. It'll be a place where modern meets traditional and where openness, inclusion, understanding, and accessibility are considered our core values. And ultimately, we want the Mabuhay district to be a place where we can discuss, define, and display what it means to be specifically Filipino-Canadian. So about a year ago, it's almost exactly a year ago now, a small group of us got together and we had a discussion about possibly having a festival that celebrated the modern cultural scene, so specifically food, art, music, and dance in Winnipeg's Filipino community, with the potential of establishing a Filipino district somewhere here in the city. We didn't know how much traction we would get, but by March of this year, we actually had over 200 people involved, and we established a cultivation festival as our nonprofit organization. Our inaugural festival was actually supposed to be this past June, but because of COVID, that didn't happen. But we have our fingers crossed for next year, and we are still very much looking forward to establishing a cultural district in the city. What's really exciting for us, the most exciting possibility for us, is that we feel like we're right at the very beginning of what this district could become. Just listening to the other presenters, I know that we're probably 10, 20, maybe 30 years behind where you guys were. We are today where you guys were maybe 30 years ago. And what's really interesting about Winnipeg is that it's an incredibly diverse city. There's a lot of very, very vibrant cultures here, and a lot of roots to their countries as well. So we actually feel that if we do it correctly, the Mabuhay district could actually become sort of a template or a prototype for some of these other communities to follow, so that in the end, we might even end up with this sort of network or mosaic of districts, cultural districts, that are not only working within themselves, but also with each other to sort of advance Winnipeg as an economic stronghold. And for us, one of the most exciting and interesting communities that we'd like to work with is actually our Indigenous community, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, just to see if we can help strengthen their position and support them, and ultimately give back to the country that said Mabuhay to our families so long ago. So I know that's a lot to cover, but I just wanted to take a second just to say, on behalf of all of Cultivation Festival, thank you so much for inviting us to be involved in this event. And we hope that this is just the beginning of a very long discussion with you guys about cultural districts. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Joseph. I think you gave me another reason to immigrate to Canada.
Another reason.
I think you guys are onto something. It's really exciting to see the progress of our brothers and sisters up north. So what I wanted to do is bring all the panelists together and ask a couple of questions. You know, we all have hopes, dreams, and aspirations for our cultural districts. But what are the obstacles that you're finding that are preventing you from making the ultimate vision come about? And I'd like to start with Dillon over in Stockton.
Oh, like there's a ton of obstacles, right? Like I'll probably dealing with like institutionalized racism, right? I mean, I don't know how to get into it without kind of going off on it, but you know, obviously the Central Valley has faced many issues, and I think for us, it's about returning to a legacy. You know, the fact that our people were involved in one of the greatest social justice movements in the world, the farm labor movement, and we started it. And I think the way we're going about it is trying to instill that legacy into our young people and be able to move forward. But there's much to be done on business, politics, environment, everything. One of the things I didn't get to explain was that the reason why I showed the hearse going by, Dawn's hearse going by, was that she died of an asthma attack, and she was born and raised in South Stockton. That's in the 100 percentile for asthma-related issues. The simple fact that we were relegated into that neighborhood meant that at a very, very young age, her life was already limited. And these are kind of the things that we have to rectify to create a thriving neighborhood before we can even really talk about historic preservation. Right? And they're the pink elephants in the rooms that are definitely part of those hurdles.
Joe, over in LA, are you finding the same kind of challenges or a different set?
More or less the same, but also different. I think one of our obstacles in general is the kind of multiple and sometimes differing opinions on what a cultural district should be, right? There are some folks who simply just want it to be like a commercial district, and there are other folks who, you know, it's an actual neighborhood that they live in, and they care about displacement, or they care about the nuanced recycling center in the neighborhood, I want to echo what Dillon said about about institutional racism. There's a reason why Filipinos were relegated to that certain area in Los Angeles, and more or less it's an area where a lot of low-income Filipinos live, and so you might have middle class Filipinos who don't live in the area, who might have a different view of what historic Filipino town should be. There's a lot of energy around it. There's a lot of wanting to bring, cultural capital, actual, political and economic capital to the area. But that also might be in contradictory to some of the stuff that's going on inside the neighborhood. So there's a lot of differing opinions of what the district should be and how it should move forward. The presentation that I gave, all the different kind of cultural landmarks or businesses, it's been more or less kind of kalat, right? So like there are different interests who kind of come into the neighborhood, or people who generated, who come from the neighborhood and kind of generated some kind of activity for the community. So again, it's kind of harnessing a lot of that energy, harnessing a lot of those opinions, and trying to come up with like a good solution for the community in historic Filipino town, as well as all of Southern California.
Joe, you touched upon something that's really interesting, is when we bring communities of people together, there are often varying viewpoints of how we move forward. So I want to throw this question to Raquel. How do you manage the different constituencies, the different interests, and the different viewpoints of your community in SOMA Pilipinas?
Thanks, Desi. So as we speak, that's actually something that we are still dealing with on a daily basis, because there's so many challenges facing our community. And so sometimes there's a tendency to for people to kind of just think about their own priorities, whether it be their small business or their organization or their particular issue area. And so I think what's made SOMA Pilipinas successful, and when we have been successful, is when we've been able to really see the larger picture, and that we are all in this together. And you see the photo in 2016, it was really faced with a major development that really threatened our community, that people came together to oppose it, and then to also really demand the final recognition of the cultural district. It's I would say along the lines of Dillon and Joe, institutional racism is real, environmental racism is real, and I think in this right now, also the myth of Filipinos as a model minority is also something that is still very real. So even with San Francisco talking about racial equity, when they speak of that, they're not necessarily thinking of Filipinos. So it's really important for us to really not be divided internally as a community, but also divided from our other communities, like the African American community, the indigenous communities, Latinx communities. And I really appreciate what Joseph said around how the Mabuhay district could be something that could pave the way for other cultural districts. And to me, that's really incredible, just to frame it in that way, that we are not in competition with other communities, but actually our success could mean success for other communities. And so I think it's that outlook that we really need to help encourage even within our own communities, because there are sometimes within our community the idea that, if one organization gets the resource, that means less for them. But that's really not true. We all need to come together to demand more from, in our case, the city, right? Or from foundations, or from, philanthropic communities to invest more in our communities.
Cool. I'm going to do something a little bit different to the panelists, because I want to go a little bit off script, but I think it's an important question that needs to be asked. I hear from Dillon that there's a lot of systematic racism in his community. So I want to go around and ask the government, Are they your friend or your foe, and why? So Joseph from the Mabuhay district, could you answer that question for us?
For sure. It's at this point, it's to be determined. To be honest, when we sort of first set out this venture of cultivation, we knew that our biggest obstacle was actually going to be building support, and obviously that has we're working toward goals that are, 5, 10, 20, 30 years and beyond, right? So we understand that building and maintaining support is probably going to be our biggest obstacle, and there are obviously layers to that. So monetary support and whatnot, but when it comes to the government, they've already invited themselves to the table, I guess you could say, right? They caught wind of what we were about and what we were wanting to do, and they came to us, right? So that's a positive thing that we've seen, but only time will tell, right? We know that we're going to need support from all levels of government, not just in terms of monetary support, but even just as leadership for the community, and also legislative support, getting things passed that will actually help encourage entrepreneurs, for example, to be in the area, and for businesses to develop in that area, and for families to move into that area. We know that we're going to need that support, and we will be sort of advocating for all of that as we move forward, and we're hopeful. We're actually quite optimistic about getting the support that we need from the levels of government. So it is at this point to be determined, but we are very optimistic that it can happen.
Cool. Joe over at HiFi. So the current mayor Garcetti helped make HiFi happen. Is he still a friend of the community?
Well, it's some ways yes, some ways not. I think to answer your question about is the government friend or foe, I think it kind of varies. Historically, of course, it's been a foe for the Filipino American community in LA, but I think especially in the recent years, when you have a lot of community advocating and a lot of community members who have entered government, who have advocated for the community, which might even be contradictory to what the government official might have planned. I think in that sense, it was able to get that kind of strategic planning, was able to get badly needed resources to the community from the government. I think especially since Garcetti has been mayor and council member beforehand, Filipino community has been, I don't say well represented, but well represented as best in kind of the LA history. And so hopefully that translates into more government dollars, government support for the community. But then also on the other hand, the council member who is currently in charge of Historic Filipino Town, he hasn't been as friendly to the Filipino community due to politics. And in that sense, it's been a hurdle. So again, I wouldn't say strict friend or foe. It kind of just, it varies depending on the situation.
Cool, thank you. So we're running down on time, so I wanted to move into some questions from the audience. And the first question is, oh, I can't read that from here. Uh-oh.
Is it, what are the funding sources? That one?
What are the funding sources? Why don't we have Raquel answer that question, because I know that question has been thrown at us before.
I don't get to answer the friend or foe question. It is related.
They're always our friend.
In terms of resources, right now, actually, our greatest resources are people power. And so a lot of the work in building a cultural district is really the work of people like Desi, of people like MC Byrne, folks who had helped start it. Even Dawn, one of the last things she did before she passed, she actually finalized the historic landmarking documents for the Gran Oriente. And a lot of this is in kind work and services that the community gives. So I would say that's our largest resource. In terms of financial resources, we actually had to fight to put on a ballot to get funding, a portion of the funding from the hotel tax to go to cultural districts. So we have some money, but because of COVID and the economic crisis, that money, we're going to basically end up with less money than we started with in terms of that funding source. But we continue to push the city, the various departments in the city to really provide resources for both housing, the affordable housing we need, the eviction prevention we need, the arts and the placemaking that we are pushing for. We do have some little bit of funding from the state through the California Arts Council as well as the National Endowment for the Arts. But for the most part, everything is a fight to get. And as the city is the richest city, but it's a pay-to-play politics. And so a lot of times we are organizing against people with a lot of money who are trying to build and make a lot of profit here in the Stockton market. And so we find ourselves at odds with these folks, but also with the city. And so really we need to, as a community, continue to organize so that not only could we achieve the things that we are looking to build, but that we can defend it also when we get too strong or too threatening for some of the powers that be.
Dillon, would you be comfortable answering that question of where the funding for Stockton's Manila Town goes or comes from?
Well, yeah, I mean, definitely not the county or the city. I think going back to the original question about politics, right? Like, I think there's this perception that California is extremely progressive, but in the Central Valley is actually very conservative. Like, many of the richest people in our community are the folks that profited off marginalization. Federal public policy for the Manongs and Manangs didn't allow Filipinos to own land. And so no Filipino American old money exists in our community, even though we've been there for so long. And so we have to really kind of cultivate this on our own. And like I said, the county's not funding us. The city has no money. They're coming out of bankruptcy. Our mayor is support. Our new mayor, who's one of the youngest Black mayors in the country, are doing amazing, innovative things. But that is a completely change of a direction than what's been going on. And so we have allies, but there's still a lot of enemies and a lot of things that need to be addressed in our community.
Cool. And Undiscover X team, do we have time for another question? No, unfortunately we are running out of time. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming together. And I hope the audience sees that this is kind of a historic moment. It's probably one of the first times that I know of having all of these Filipino cultural districts coming together and telling their story. And I'm hoping when we do this again, that there won't be 4 panelists, but there could be 6 panelists, and new communities around the world will start to define themselves and really forge a future for our people. So thanks again. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Undiscovered X, and we'll forward these questions to the relevant cultural districts. So thank you.